Good evening, everyone. My name is Tessa Michelson-Schmidt, and I'm the director of the Cooperative Children's Book Center, the CCBC, a library of the School of Education. Before we begin this evening, I'd like to provide a few housekeeping notes. Immediately following tonight's lecture, we will host a book signing with books available for purchase by a local bookseller, A Room of One's Own. Secondly, there will be a brief Q&A following the lecture with questions curated in advance from registered attendees. Lastly, please take a moment to silence your phones. Welcome, everyone, to the 2025 Charlotte Zolotow Lecture. Whether you are joining in person, live streaming, or viewing this recording later, we are so glad to have you part of this special event. The CCBC established this lecture to honor Charlotte Zolotow, a distinguished children's book editor at Harper Junior Books. She was also the author of more than 65 picture books, including such classic works as Mr. Rabbit and the Lovely Present and William Stahl. Ms. Zolotow attended the University of Wisconsin on a writing scholarship from 1933 to 36, where she studied with Professor Helen C. White. Tonight, Christina Soontornvat will speak to us about the universe and the details. At the CCBC, we have long admired Christina's writing. Her storytelling has taken us deep into caves, to her middle school life as a cheerleader, into a Thai-inspired fantasy world on the high seas and beyond. We are excited to hear her thoughts on the universe and the details. We are honored to have her deliver tonight's lecture. To tell you more about the power of Christina Soontornvat's writing, I invite Yui Wynn to the podium. Yui is the principal at Orchard Ridge Elementary School here in Madison. Yui is a deep reader and thinker, as well as a passionate educator. He's also in the Christina Soontornvat fan club.
Compelling authors don't just write for us, they connect us. Our guest today, the phenomenal author Christina Soontornvat, is someone who lives and breathes the idea that we are profoundly linked. So I'm going to move over here so I can see everyone. Whether she's transporting us to a thrilling fantasy world or diving into high-stakes real-life rescue, her voice is built on a radical truth: that every single person, regardless of their background, has the right to be seen, heard, and honored. This radical truth is precisely why I am so honored to be in the education profession. As an elementary school principal, teacher, and educational leader, my work is anchored by these fundamental guiding principles: that every single child has the right to a safe learning environment, and that every student has the right to a high-quality education designed to honor their assets and interests and maximize their full potential. I deeply value educators who are curious and fascinated by people, those amazing professionals who consistently see the brilliance of children each and every day. Why do I begin here? I'm glad you asked. Because having read Christina Soontornvat's books, I see these very principles woven into her narratives. She doesn't just write stories, she creates literary spaces where children have the right to be their full, authentic selves. She creates worlds where children's thinking is respected, and all the complex, messy feelings that come with being human, the fear, the shame, the hope, all are given space to be real. Great authors don't just tell us stories, they show us ourselves. As you look around this room at the faces of friends and families and complete strangers, consider this profound idea. The books we are celebrating today share a powerful belief, one our author writes in existence again and again, that every single person possesses a light that is both unique and absolutely essential to the world. This principle of seeing and validating that essential human light is what makes Christina's stories come so vividly to life. Nowhere is this clearer than in her Newbery Honor book, A Wish in the Dark, which, by the way, I'm making a prediction now, should absolutely be a movie.
Yes, yes. I like that.
If anyone knows someone who can make that movie happen, please encourage them. Please do. And I would love to be an extra in that movie. As a refugee who left Vietnam at age 5 due to political beliefs, I know intimately the tension of navigating dual identities. I felt every surge of fear, hope, and courage the characters experience, especially their deep longing for true freedom. But reading Christina's work led to a profound realization. Those very fears and that pain are not burdens. They are the genesis of our strength, the light we are meant to shine. I truly wish I had a DeLorean from Back to the Future to share this book with my younger self. Instead of yelling, Marty, I would yell out a few essential messages to young Yui. Yui, keep learning Vietnamese. Knowing another language is a strength. Yui, share your family stories in school. They are absolutely worth telling. And make sure you spend just as much time being a storyteller as a story listener. Yui, get your mom's pho recipe, even if it's made for 11 people. It might take you years to perfect it,
Aw.
but it's worth the effort. It's worth the effort. And yes, my acting career might be over before it started with that joke, but the message stands, and I can see my 12-year-old daughter in the audience right now rejecting that dad joke. For the right time. And I can tell you exactly how profound this gift is when I asked my 12-year-old daughter about the reactions to the books, particularly after she had finished the entire Legend of Lotus Island series. Her response was immediate and striking. She told me, Dad, the books speak to me. They allow me to be who I am now, not worrying about what others think, and it's authentic. To hear my middle schooler state with such clarity that the characters reflect who she authentically is, that she doesn't feel pressure to be something else or worry about external judgment, is the clearest evidence of this author's impact. Christina doesn't just write stories, she gives young readers permission to own their full present selves. Christina's work is a masterclass in seeing people completely. In her brilliant nonfiction book, All 13, The Incredible Cave Rescue of the Thai Boys Soccer Team, she tells the story of ordinary people doing amazing things, reminding us of the immense power of human connection and support. And honestly, this was the most fun I've had reading a work of nonfiction in a long time. Christina elevates the stories of countless local heroes. The families who supported one another, the folks who understood the unique Thai landscape, and the volunteers who rallied to make and distribute food throughout the ordeal. The book doesn't just detail a rescue, it shares the culmination of the best of humanity. Tonight, let's celebrate this profound connection to recognize the recognition that our stories Our struggles and our hopes are linked. Our guest is here to share her wisdom and to encourage us all to embrace and shine our own light. Please join me now in welcoming the 3-time Newbery honoree, the incredible, the inspiring Christina Soontornvat.
You'll be in the movie for sure. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. I am so honored to be a speaker for the Charlotte Zolotow lecture. I just really cannot believe I'm one of the authors who's going to be talking to you. It's been so many famous, incredible authors that I love, so I'm just pinching myself. And it's wonderful to be at the CCBC, and thank you so much to the librarians and to all of the students who work there. You know, I have known about your work for a long time. You know, the CCBC it's world famous. Like, people know about it, the book lists. It's not just a Madison thing, but so special that you have it right here. And so when I came up, I was like, okay, I'm gonna meet like the whole giant team that works here and does all of this work that goes all around the world. And I was like, who puts together all the book lists? And they were like, us, 3. I was like, oh my gosh, you do so much work and have such a big impact. So thank you so much for all that you do. I think we should give them a huge hand. Author Jacqueline Woodson, and she said this during an interview that she had about Brown Girl Dreaming, which is this incredible book, and I read it at a time when I was feeling really low. So I read it when I really wanted to be a published author, and I was like going nowhere. I had been trying for years to get my first book published, and when you're like that, I know we have authors in the audience, when you're at that point, sometimes it's really painful to like go into a bookstore and you see all of these books and you're like, I'm never gonna be there, it's never gonna happen for me. But I remember I picked up Brown Girl Dreaming, and it was just exactly the book I needed to read. It was so inspiring. It's a memoir of her life growing up in the South and in Brooklyn in the 60s and 70s, and just becoming the person that she is. And I was just like, oh my God, it's written in verse, so that every page is this incredible poem. It's like, this is showing me what children's literature can be. It's so great. I want to keep going, keep trying. And so an interviewer asked her if when she was writing it, she ever worried that a wide audience would be able to relate to this, because this is the story of her life. And she said, there were definitely points in writing it that I felt like no one else would be interested. It's such a specific story to my life, but I think that's what we don't get about the specifics. The more specific we are, the more universal something can become. Life is in the details. If you generalize, it doesn't resonate. The specificity of it is what resonates. So I'm going to talk to you about my work. I'm going to tell you the details, and you'll see. Hopefully it will resonate for you. So if you want to know the details of my life, the most important detail is that I am from Texas. Okay? And just in case you have any doubt, when you're from Texas, they make sure in your school picture that no one can doubt that you're from Texas. You have a photo like this? We'll photo. My friend Lily's here. You might have a picture like this. So my parents had really different backgrounds. My dad is an immigrant, and he's from Thailand, and my mom's family had lived in Texas for many generations. And I grew up hearing stories of their childhood. So my dad, he would always tell me stories of what it was like to grow up in Thailand. He immigrated when he was 19. So he grew up in Bangkok, and his family was pretty poor. They struggled a lot. And so Bangkok now, I always feel like, I want to show you what it looks like now. It's this huge metropolis. It's as big as New York City, millions of people there, skyscrapers, super high tech. But when he was growing up in the 50s, it looked very different. So Bangkok has always been a city on the river, but at that time, the river was even more central to everyday life. So a lot of people lived on the river, their businesses would be on the river. My dad's family, their business was they had a cargo boat that went up and down the river. And he would sometimes get in a boat to go to school or to go to a friend's house. He would have to take a boat to go there. And so he would tell all of these stories. And I just thought that was so cool. The other stories he would talk about is he would talk about how he was a monk. So this is really common in Thailand and in Vietnam too. I think it's a really common custom that you would, it's like a rite of passage. If you're a young man, you would go and live in the monastery and you would go be a monk for a little while. And my favorite stories that he would tell was he would talk about how he was not a good monk. So when you're a monk, you mostly spend hours and hours meditating, praying, right? And you fast. So you don't eat anything after noon until the sunrise the next day. But my dad, was really having a hard time with this. So he would sneak away from the temple and he would go to his house and go get into his kitchen and eat and then go back to the temple and dust the crumbs off of his robe or something. And pretend he hadn't done that. So I loved stories about that. So he came to the US, I think it was 1967 when he immigrated with his brother. And this was just after President Johnson, he signed a new law that removed all of these quotas. So before 1965, it was really, really hard to immigrate to the US, especially if you were from Africa, from Asia, South America. So this really changed everything. So him and my uncle came and they dressed in their best suits. They looked like the Beatles with the skinny tie, the skinny suits. And so they took this long plane ride and they landed in Los Angeles, and their friend who had already immigrated the year before picked them up. And he had no shoes, bell bottoms, his Hawaiian shirt completely unbuttoned, long hair. He was like, "Welcome to America." And my dad was like, "Okay, yeah." And he became a hippie, and he never went back after that. So he made his way to Texas, and he met my mom in Texas, and they got married there. And so I was born in North Texas. So growing up, I was really close to both of my grandparents, both sets. So I had my Texas grandparents, and they lived in their little farm town in East Texas, and my Thai grandparents. I'd go see them every year. We'd go and spend a month or so in Thailand. And they didn't speak any English, but we were really, really close to each other. So the other detail about my life you have to know is that my parents had a restaurant. So this is a huge part of my upbringing. They were driving through Parker County, and they noticed this town that they drove through had no Asian food at all. So they opened the first Asian food restaurant in that whole county. It was called Golden Moon Restaurant, and at first it served American Chinese food, so chicken chow mein and mugu gai pan, but also chicken fried steak was on the menu, and French fries, and because this was an ancient time. This was 1984, okay? And people didn't know what Thai food was. So eventually we started putting Thai food on the menu. So I was always hanging out at the restaurant. My parents were always working, so I always had to be there. And I think this is where I kind of started hearing stories and learning what it means to tell a good story. Because, the customers would come in and they would talk about their stories of what's going on with them. And then the waiters, they all had their own stories that they would share. And they tell the same ones over and over again, tell the same jokes over and over again. A lot of dad jokes. Sorry for your dad joke. So I think that's where I kind of learned to be a storyteller, was at the restaurant. But for reading, the reason I'm a huge reader is because of my mom. So my mom was a really big reader. And she's the one who took me to libraries, to bookstores. We had to go a long way to go to the bookstore, but she always made sure that we had books in the house, and she was never without a book. So for example, I remember this trip we took to Thailand to go visit my grandparents, and she packed this massive book, and it was 1,600 pages. And I think the reason is because at that time, the English bookstores were really hard to find in Thailand, if you could find them at all, and they were really expensive. So I think she brought the biggest book she could bring so that would last her for the whole trip. So there was this incredible book called Les Miserables, and she would read the book during the day, and I was like 10, and she would tell me the story at night. So she would retell the story. So she told me this fascinating story. It's about this guy who was convicted of a crime, and then he was put on parole. So he was released from prison, but he had to keep checking in with the law. And he just ran away. He broke his parole and escaped and tried to start a new life. And this police officer was obsessed with catching him and turning him back in. And there were all these characters, and it took place in Paris, and there was a revolution going on. So it was just oh my God, it was the best story I ever heard. And later, when I got older, I read the book for myself, and then the musical was touring, and I got obsessed with the musical. I could do every single part of the musical. Afterwards, after the book signing, if you want to do a sing-along, I could do every single one. So that was just her getting me into theater, into stories, into reading. That I owe all of that to her. So I grew up, as one of the only. I have the exact same bangs as I had. Okay, this is 4th grade, and my haircut hasn't changed. I grew up, I was one of the only Asian American kids in this little town. And I loved books. I liked reading, but I also liked writing. I would make up my own stories. I loved fantasy stories the most. That was my favorite kind of book, like Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And I would write my own fantasy stories, but I never once thought about being an author. It never crossed my mind. I mean, the only authors that I knew were if you turn the book over and you looked on the back of who the author was, and all the authors in our library were mostly British. They were mostly dead already, okay? So I just, I didn't read a book by an Asian American author until I was out of school. I didn't read a book by a Texas author, like a rural author, really, until I was out of school. And so it was really hard to imagine me as being one of those people. I just didn't imagine it. But I always really liked math and science. I was good at math and science. So when I went to college, that's what I studied. I studied mechanical engineering. Okay, I took the easy way to be a children's author, the easy road. I studied engineering, and I got a job in science museums. So I was designing exhibits and programs for kids, and I did that for like 10 years, and I loved that job. That whole time, I was still, I was still reading a lot, I was still thinking of stories, but I really didn't have an outlet for that until I became an aunt, okay? In Texas, we call it aunt. I was an aunt. But I'll say aunt, so you won't know what I'm talking about. So my husband's brother had 2 little kids, and if you're an aunt, you know the difference between being an aunt and a mom is that an aunt is cool, okay? An aunt gets to be cool. And I was like so cool. I was gonna be the coolest aunt. And my nieces were so sweet. They were born in Ireland, okay? They kind of, their early years were in Ireland. And whenever we would go and see them, I had this great relationship with them, and I started making up a story for them. And I started making up a story about 2 sisters, and the little sister gets kidnapped by fairies, and the big sister has to go and rescue her. And I would write the story for them, and I would send it to them in the mail. And then they would write me back, and they would be like, what happens next? And so I would have to think about it, write the next part of the story, send it to the mail. Cool aunt, right? Yeah. Like the best. And so it took like a year. I finished the story, and it had all this like Irish folklore, and it was very, very British Isles based. And after it was finished, I thought, okay, I'm going to try to get it published, get this made into a children's book. So I'm not going to go into the years. I talked to you about the years of depression, of like being rejected, and you're trying so hard to get published, but that did become my first published book. It was called The Changelings. So after I published the story, I was like, okay, this is great, this is amazing. I'm going to write another book. I'm going to come up with another story. What am I going to write next? And I have been thinking about telling a story about a boy who's an apprentice to a mat maker. A boy who works for a mat maker. And his name was Tom Ledger. And the world that I built around this story was it was like a mix of Charles Dickens and Roald Dahl and Thomas the Tank Engine. Okay, it was very British, all right? And I wrote it, and I wrote the whole thing. I wrote the whole book. It took years to write it, wrote it, rewrote it, finished, and I was like, okay, I got this. I'm ready to start sending it out to editors. And I started to send it out, and I was getting rejections for this one. And you know, the editors would say, you know, the writing is pretty good, but there's just something about it that it's missing something. We can't put our finger on it, or you know, this just isn't right for us. It's just not what we're looking for right now. Like, I'm talking editor after editor. We sent it to like every editor with a pulse. Some maybe without a pulse, okay? And they rejected it too. So it was like so devastating. You know, it's different. You try to get your first book published, but then the second one, and you can't get it off the ground. You start feeling like, oh man, maybe I'm like, that was just a fluke. Just that first book was a fluke. So I was like, okay, I don't know if I really have this. But around that same time, there was something really exciting happening in children's literature. So, you know, there have always been authors who have had to fight to get their stories told. And there's always been people who fight alongside them. And I feel like CCBC is one of the long-standing fighters, a warrior for getting diverse stories told. But at about this time, 2015, there was this big grassroots movement to try to get more diverse stories told, and not just published, but also marketed and celebrated. And there was this surge of stories that started to be on bookshelves that I never saw when I was a kid. And so now there are these authors who are telling their stories coming from this place of being authentically them, and they didn't have to worry about that they would be labeled as just being niche, you know, that they could be commercial, they could be broadly accepted, they could be a universal story. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna try this again. I'm gonna go back to the drawing board. I'm gonna try writing a new story. I'm just gonna go for it. I'm just gonna do something different. So why don't I take a book that I really loved, a story I loved, but I'm gonna put a twist on it. So I took Les Miserables and I said, well, what if instead of being set in Paris, I set this in a city that's sort of like Bangkok. And instead of being this Christian story of justice and redemption, what if it's a Buddhist story of justice and redemption? And what if the main character is based on, like, you know, kind of a scrappy kid like my dad's stories of growing up? And so that's how I wrote A Wish in the Dark. That's where it came from, all those details of my life. So this is a story of a boy who runs away from the prison that he's born in, and the prison warden's daughter is obsessed with catching him and turning him in. And we can come up with a soundtrack for this one too, if you want. We can sing it also. So this book went into production. I was so excited. I was like, I can't believe I'm going to have another book out. This one is going to be set in Thailand. That's so meaningful. And I had no idea that same year I would actually have 2 books that were set in Thailand, because the next book that came about was a complete accident. This was not planned in any way. If you would have asked me, would you ever write nonfiction? I'll be like, there's no way. I'm not a nonfiction writer. So I want to tell you about All 13. So this took place in 2018, and in 2018 we were on a trip to visit my family. So I have family that lives in Bangkok, but I also have family that lives up in the northern part of Thailand in the mountains. And so we were there visiting my cousins and my uncle. And can you tell it's like kind of rainy in the pictures, right? While we were there. Well, the day that our plane landed to visit our family, we started hearing about this news story. It became this really really big news story, and maybe you have heard it. If you're a grown-up, you're going to remember it. If you're a kid, you might not remember it. But it was a soccer team, 12 kids on a soccer team, and their coach had gone hiking in a cave, and while they were inside the cave, it started to rain, and the cave flooded, and they were trapped inside. They were trapped inside for 10 days before they were discovered, and then it took another 8 days to rescue them. It was this big international team that rescued them. They had to scuba dive them out through this flooded cave. Are you guys familiar with this story? I know the grown-ups will be familiar with the story. So this was happening while we were in the country. And so, like at first we were just watching on the news and seeing, oh, these kids went missing in this cave. Are they going to find them? And then it just snowballed into this huge international news story. And we followed it so closely while we were there. It was on every television. Everybody was talking about it. Everyone was on their phones watching it. And then we actually flew back to the United States before they finished rescuing them. So it took 3 days to rescue the kids. And so we flew back before they got the last group out. And so it was really fascinating because I had watched the news in Thailand and seen it there, and then we got to the United States and watching the news it was on, every news station, right? And so what I noticed was in the U.S., they were talking a lot about the British divers, the European divers, the American military, the Australian divers who helped to get the kids out, which those were absolutely, these guys were heroes. Like, the kids would never have survived if it hadn't been for those rescuers. But I felt like there was really something that was missing from the story. I had seen the Thai military on the news so much, doing so much there, and there were just thousands of Thai volunteers who came to try to do whatever they could to help the kids and help the rescuers. I think it was like 10,000 volunteers who were there over the course of the time. And then, of course, like the boys' families, they were always there. They never left the cave. And at the center of the story were the boys themselves. And I felt like there were all of these details that if you don't have all of them, you can't really understand the full story and like how everything fits together. So I was like, I gotta do this. I have to write this book. I have to include everything, make sure everything is included. So I did that. So I got a book deal to write the book, and I got back on a plane and went back to Thailand and to do research and to interview the people who were involved in the rescue. And my dad came with me. He was my translator because I am not fluent in Thai, so I needed him to help me with these interviews. And actually, my whole family came to be translators. So we had a van, and it was my dad and my uncle and my cousins. And so whenever I would do an interview, we would all pile out of the car. And like, I'm sure people were like, why? I didn't sign up for all of these people. But they were so helpful, telling me everything and translating not just like people's words, but also, this particular place in Thailand. It's special, this little region. So went there and went to the town where the boys were from. They're from a really small town called Masai, and it's up near the border. It's right on the border with Myanmar. Tiny town. It felt like very familiar, like being from a small town in Texas. But as soon as you get outside of the town, you get into the countryside, and it's just so lush, so green. There's the mountains everywhere, the jungle. I mean, like, you can tell this is a place where it rains a lot, right? And most of the people who are there work in agriculture. They're farmers. They farm rice and tea and, are growing fruit and things like that. So it's just so incredible to be there and to be meeting the people who are involved in this rescue. So the thing about a small town, I think a small town in America would be like this too, is that everyone knows everyone. So like I would meet someone and they would be talking about how they helped in the rescue, and they would be like, you gotta meet my cousin, because he drove the motorcycle that brought the supplies, and then he would be like, oh, you gotta talk to my girlfriend, she's the one who packed the lunches for everybody. So it was like every single time I talked to someone, they had me talk to somebody else. And you felt like the scope of how much this community pitched in to try to rescue these boys. And so talked to them. I also talked to the engineers who were this was kind of like an unknown part of the story, is that while the divers were trying to find the boys and locate them and get them out through the front of the cave, there were also engineers who were working all over the mountain trying to stop more water from flowing into the cave because they were trying to get the water levels to go down. So I talked to them, and this is like, finally my engineering degree is coming in handy, right? My dad was like, that's finally the thing that we paid for. But they showed me where they were doing all of their work, because they're up on top of the mountain working. And if you look, you see how steep it is and how treacherous and how covered in jungle. And to think about these guys are going up there every day and trying to stop this water, stop Mother Nature, right? And so they were, using pipes and ropes, but sometimes they didn't have pipes. So this was a very Thai ingenuity, scrappy group, and they would just cut down bamboo and make their own pipes out of the bamboo. I mean, and they just worked for 18 days solid, hardly sleeping at all. I interviewed the people in the military. I interviewed the divers. A lot of the people that I interviewed, we did the interview at the temple, because especially in a village, in a small Thai town, the temple is like the center of life. So people would ask to meet me there. And I interviewed the head monk at the temple. And this is where most of the boys will come here every single day after school. They just come there to eat snacks, and eat the snacks the monks aren't allowed to eat. and hang out and do their homework and everything. And this was also the temple where their coach was a monk. So their coach is this really special person, and he's really the reason why they survived. So I heard from the guy who mentored him what kind of a person he was. He was a monk for years before he became a soccer coach, and he was actually a good monk, not like my dad. He was very devoted to being a monk. And so even when he became a soccer coach, he had the kids meditate as part of their practice. Every practice or before every game, they would meditate as a team, center themselves. And that's what he was doing inside the cave. He had them doing that. They were meditating and praying every day together. It's just a way to stay calm and to stay focused as a group. And, I just felt like this is such a crucial part of the story that, in Thailand and really anywhere outside of the United States, soccer is so big. It is a complete obsession. If you go to the tiniest little town, they will not have anything in the town but a temple and a soccer field, right? And the kids, they play in flip-flops, or they're playing barefoot. So these kids have played soccer for years together. They've been this team, they've been this unit, and then they've also meditated together before. So this is not their first time to be, really trying to stay in control of their thoughts, staying positive, helping each other, maintaining a good attitude. And when you're in a survival situation, that's the number one. Everybody thinks, it's about the physical ordeal of the survival situation, but it's really about the mental ordeal that you're going through. So learning all about that about them was so wonderful. And then I didn't think or plan that I was going to get to meet them, but at the end of my research trip, I got to meet them. It was actually in Los Angeles. So I got a chance. They were doing a dinner at the Thai embassy in Los Angeles, and I flew back from Thailand to go to Los Angeles to meet them. And I remember being I was standing there at the embassy with the ambassador. I had flown back from Thailand, and I had to go to the mall and go to H&M and quickly buy a blazer because I didn't have anything to wear to go to the dinner with the ambassador. I'm standing next to the ambassador, and their tour bus pulls up, and I'm like, man, what are these kids going to be like? Because I've just been hearing, thinking about them and this ordeal. Are they going to be upset? Are they going to be down? Are they going to be traumatized? And they came off the bus. It was like a wave of chlorine smell. And the woman who was kind of their director was like, I'm sorry we're late. I couldn't get them out of the pool. And it was just so classic because, of course, if you're a kid on a vacation, you just want to swim in the hotel pool. You don't want to go hang out with the ambassador. So it was just so clear they're just like any other kid anywhere, right? Any kid in Madison. And that's kind of the beauty of the story, is that they got through this really horrible thing together, and if they could do it, any of us could do it too. So after that book, after finishing that book, I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna go back and take a look at this other book that I had worked on before and dust it off and just like revisit it. And as soon as I did that, after the experience of working on these books, I was like, okay, it's so obvious why nobody wanted to buy this book. It was so clear I was trying to be someone that I'm not, right? Like writing like Thomas the Tank Engine. And I've never been to England before, okay? So I was not being my true self. And so I said, okay, I'm gonna scrap it. I'm going to take it down to the bones. I'm going to keep like just the bare minimum of what the story was, but I'm going to completely rewrite it. So I said, all right, I'm going to set this in a world. It's going to be a fantasy world, which it always was, but it's going to be based on Thailand. And it's going to have a lot of Thai customs and the names and the foods and the way of living. And then also, it's not just the world that had to change, the character had to change too, because I had to be able to get into her head. And so I changed it from a boy, and it was written in third person originally, so I rewrote it for her to be more like me and to write it in first person. And so the story, I said, I really wanted to write the story about a map maker. I've always loved maps, especially looking at old maps. Like, oh, it's just like so much mystery, so many cool stories when you're looking at an old map. And if you look at old maps, sometimes the artist that makes the map will draw dragons and monsters on the map. And maybe they thought there really were monsters or dragons in these places, in these dangerous places, or maybe they just didn't want you to go there. So I thought, okay, this book definitely has to have a dragon in it. And it's not just going to be any dragon. It's going to be like a Southeast Asian dragon. So in Thailand, we call them Naga. So they're like a water dragon, like a real water beast. So that is how, the last map maker really changed. And as soon as I started doing that, as soon as I started writing from a place of actual real authenticity, the whole thing really came together. And so, finally, I got it through my skull. It took a while that, just because you're an author and you're making things up and you're making up stories, you're not just making it up out of the air. You're making it up out of here, right? Like your stories are coming from you. So the more you can write about things that you're passionate about and that are true to you, the better the story is going to be. So I have done that for every subsequent book, and every book has been really close to my heart. So, in the tryout and in the squad, these are memoirs of my life growing up in Texas. So I talk about growing up in the restaurant and what it's like to grow up in a small town in Texas, and it's just been so great to share that. So when we talk about diversity in literature, one of the things we talk about is representation. And representation is so important. It's, like you was saying, that every kid deserves to see themselves in a book. When you walk into a library, when you walk into a bookstore, you want to feel like there's a story that that represents you, that shows you. And I have gotten to meet kids who tell me that they feel very clearly, very specifically represented in my books. That's so, so special. I feel like a lot of my readers, in fact, I think the majority of my readers, they don't look like the characters in my books. Like on the surface of things, it might seem like they don't have anything in common with them. And yet, they read these books and they read the details of my life, the details of my story, and they feel like that story belongs to them. They feel so connected to it. In the same way that, I didn't have a lot in common with Jacqueline Woodson, who, and her growing up in the South and in Brooklyn, but I felt so connected to that story. And that, it still lingers with me today. I think books have the power to transcend all of the differences we get told are important. And I think that's why they're so powerful and why they're so feared by the people who would benefit from keeping us apart and keeping us feeling like we're different from each other. So one of the organizations that I'm a part of is called Authors Against Book Bans, and we're a group of authors who we've come together to push back against this big surge that's happening in book banning and censorship. And you probably are aware, especially since Banned Books Week was last week, right? And there was a time when I really felt like there is no way we're going back to the time before diverse books. Like we've come so far, we're not going to go back again. But there has been such a backlash against diversity and such a powerful pushback that I feel really strongly that we really are going to have to fight for these books and for these voices. We really are going to all have to get together and push back just as hard because there's so much that we risk losing. It's a whole universe of stories that we're at risk of losing. So with that, I will end my talk. Thank you very much. And I think maybe Tessa has some questions. Just in case you forgot, okay? I got a lot of pictures like this.
Wow. Wow, Christina, thank you so much for expanding our universe this evening. What a pleasure. As indicated before the start of the lecture, we have time for a brief Q&A, and I'm going to share some of the questions that were submitted in advance. Your virtuosity across multiple genres and formats, from fantasy fiction to nonfiction, graphic novels to picture books, is a gift for young readers. When you get an idea for a book, is the genre or format typically part of the initial concept, or do you consider various approaches? Do you have a favorite type of writing? Something you haven't tried yet but would like to?
Oh, yeah. Definitely I've had stories that started off as one thing and they changed. So like the Tryout, which is the graphic novel, that started off as a picture book. And an editor that I submitted it to gave me the feedback of like, you're trying to tell too much of a story in this picture book. So I had to rethink that and make it be a graphic novel. But I think I really like to jump around. I get bored doing one thing too much. Like if I'm doing a lot of graphic novels or picture books, I like to get into writing like a longer fantasy novel. I think fantasy is probably my favorite. It's just the most fun for me. And I have never written historical fiction, but I love to read historical fiction. I just don't know. I don't know if I could do all the research that's involved, and there's so much research involved in historical fiction, but maybe someday. And you know what? Actually, the 90s is historical fiction. Did you know that? It's depressing. So maybe I could write a book set in the 90s.
Thank you. Second question. I appreciate the complexity of your fictional protagonist and world building in A Wish in the Dark and The Last Map Maker, and the way the book's social justice themes don't feel heavy-handed, even with the obvious parallels to the real world. Your young characters are vivid and relatable, while their deepening compassion and agency is something I, as an adult reader, find hopeful. Do you have hopes for what young readers might take away from these stories besides enjoyment?
Oh, that's so nice. I love it when a question is full of compliments. And I don't get that when I go to schools. The kids don't like
What's your favorite color?
Yeah, right. I talked about Les Miserables, and I don't think I emphasized how much that book changed me when I finally got to actually read it. I kept trying to read it, and it was really, really hard, and it wasn't until I was a senior in high school where I could actually read it. And the thing that I loved about it so much is that nothing was cut and dry. I just felt like the whole time I was reading it, I was like, oh, do I feel this way or do I feel that way? And like what? It was like really making me question all of these things that I thought. And so that's what I try to do in the books. It's not like your character is going to be like, and then I realized that everyone should just be themselves. Like, no, I think no kid wants to read that, right? Like, I think especially for middle grade, for like 12, 13, 14 years old, like you are really ready to like grapple with things and think about like, okay, what do I think here? And sometimes there's not cut and dry answers. So I would say if there's just one takeaway that I think goes across all of my books, even all the ones that are so different, it's the idea that what you do matters, even if it's small.
that one person makes a difference, even if you're not saving the world from a dragon or something. Like one person, one action can really make a difference. So I think that's there in all my books.
What are you working on right now, and what books of yours can we read next?
Oh, yeah. I'm working on several things right now. So next year I'll have 3 books come out. And so one of them is a 3rd graphic novel. So there's The Tryout and the Squatter out now. And then the 3rd one is going to be called The Break. And what does that mean? Broken bones? Maybe. Broken friendships? Possibly. Broken hearts? Definitely, okay? So I'm really excited for that. That'll come out next year. And then I have a fantasy novel that is about a bird who gets transformed into a boy by a mistaken wish, like an accidental wish gets him transformed into a boy. And he has to figure out how to go back to being a bird so that he can rejoin his flock. And it's loosely tied into A Wish in the Dark, but it's not. It's its own standalone. And then I'm also working on a fun tween light novel that I'm writing with my friend Sarah Mlanovsky. So we're writing that together. And it's so fun to write with another person because it's half as much work, almost. So yeah, so that's all coming out next year. But you can just reread all my books over and over and over. Then the next year, every single day, read a different Christina Soontornvat book, and then go back and do that again.
Well, Christina, thank you for responding to these questions from our guests this evening. Your time with us was greatly appreciated.
Thank you
So
so much.
let's have one more round of applause for Christina Soontornvat.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I'm going to now invite Christina to make her way to the book signing table while I provide some final comments. Please stay seated. So in conclusion of this special evening, I want to take the time to acknowledge the careful work that went into planning this event. First, our gratitude to the Friends of the CCBC for sponsoring the hospitality for Christina Soontornvat's visit. We are also pleased to plan this annual event in conjunction with the Wisconsin Book Festival. We thank the staff at Merit for making this room and technology work for our needs. We offer additional thanks to Dean Marcel Haddix of the School of Education, the Communications and Advancement Team, and Betsy Burns at the UW Foundation for their support of our work. I also want to acknowledge the CCBC student staff who assisted with a variety of tasks to help us prepare for tonight, especially Lauren and Natalie. Thank you to CCBC librarian Mary Lindgren for the impeccable event planning, and to Madeline Tyner-Frymuth for website and technical assistance. In the coming weeks, the archive recording of tonight's lecture will be found on the CCBC website. You can also find links to past lectures as well as information about the Charlotte Zolotow Fund that makes this event happen. Looking ahead, we are pleased to announce the 2026 Zolotow Lecture. The lecture will be delivered by Matthew Cordell. Matthew Cordell is the Caldecott Medal-winning author and illustrator of Wolf in the Snow, Evergreen, Cornbread and Poppy, Wish, and Hello Neighbor, The Kind and Caring World of Mr. Rogers. He is also the illustrator of numerous highly acclaimed children's books that have been translated into many languages for readers around the world. Next year's lecture will be held on October 15th, 2026 in the same venue. Now that we've given Christina a few minutes to get ready for the book signing, we are ready to conclude. There is still time to buy books from a room of one's own. For those interested in getting book signs, we're going to ask you to make a single file line near Christina, and we're going to ask you to be considerate as folks are either heading to the book sale or a book signing or just making their way out of the room this evening. Thank you all for joining us for the annual Zolotow Lecture. We'll see you next year.